I recall traveling with you to Beijing for the U.S. Strategic and Economic Dialogue. I saw all of the preparation that went into that event. Here we have a White House adamant that there's going to be spontaneity. They want a good personal relationship with this Chinese counterpart. How difficult is that going to be achieved, given the history of how meetings like these are conducted?
Well, David, I think it's important to remember this is a first meeting between the two leaders, and it is very important that at this meeting they develop a personal rapport where they can do business when they agree and when they disagree, and there will be occasions for both. The China relationship is the most important bilateral relationship in the world, economically and increasingly in terms of global security. And I think the list of issues that is confronting these two leaders is extremely important in terms of our economic well-being, and when you add the issues regarding the DPRK in terms of our national security as well. So I think the stakes are very high for this to be a meeting where the leaders establish that kind of relationship. I think that the preparation that has gone into these kinds of meetings in the past has been quite considerable. There has in the past been the expectation of clear deliverables, results at the end. I would suspect that this is more of an initial meeting, but it is important that coming out of it, there is a way to work together going forward, and hopefully a bit of stepping back from some of the rhetoric.
How damaging has that rhetoric been? Certainly there was a lot of forceful rhetoric on the campaign trail. We've heard some since the president came into office. From what you know about how the Chinese perceive what's going on here in the U.S., how damaging do you think it's been?
My sense is that the Chinese are very aware of American politics, and they are willing to look at rhetoric for what rhetoric is, and then they look at actions for what actions are. So I think coming out of this meeting is going to be very important in terms of sending a signal as to what kind of actions the United States is actually going to take. And that covers a whole host of issues. So I think there's some room for some space between the two and to have a strong relationship. Fundamentally, our economic interests have to be zealously protected. We didn't hold back on criticizing China when we thought China was wrong. But we also acknowledged when they moved in a positive direction. We also knew when we needed their assistance that it had to be from the perspective of how do we advance something that's in our two national interests. There will be issues on which we disagree, and you've got to be able to sort the two separately.
Something that came up numerous times on the campaign trail, has come up less since the president took office, is the issue of currency manipulation. This is something that's within the Treasury's purview to designate a country as a currency manipulator. Here you have China with a trade deficit. Is that enough to declare China a currency manipulator? How cautiously should the Treasury proceed?
Look, I think that if you look at the criteria that are generally considered and that are now part of the Treasury's technical process, the key issue is, are they taking actions to drive down the value of their currency to gain unfair advantage? The way you look to measure that is, are they intervening in order to devalue their currency? For the last year, China has been intervening to prevent the devaluation, to support the RMB. That makes it very challenging to look at the current situation and reach a conclusion that there is currency manipulation. Clearly, there is a transition underway from a very managed exchange rate to a more market-oriented exchange rate, but it's not a pure market-oriented exchange rate. Right now, the interventions are actually in the opposite direction from what you look at in terms of measuring manipulation.
I asked you how damaging the rhetoric might be. How about the discord that we're seeing within the administration? Again, you've been the Treasury Secretary, you've been in the White House as the Chief of Staff. You've got members of this administration saying different things about currency manipulation in particular. How damaging can that confusion be?
Look, I don't think China is alone in trying to figure out which voices in the administration will turn out to be authoritative. And what makes this meeting that begins today so important is it's the first time the leaders will sit face to face. I sat in many of the meetings with President Obama and President Xi. They developed an ability to communicate very frankly, to disagree and to sometimes agree, but to come out of it making progress in many, many key areas. I think I was listening to you at the beginning. If anyone would have suggested 5 years ago that the United States and China would work together on global climate change, it would have been considered fanciful. But from Sunnylands through the Hangzhou G20, we covered an enormous space where China was our partner in putting the Paris Agreement into effect. Now, obviously, the new administration may have a different view on that. China may actually still be closer to where they were at the end of the Obama administration. They'll have to work that through. But I tell that story to illustrate how important working together is. Going into Sunnylands, it wasn't clear that we could work together on that issue. Coming out, 4 years, 3 years later, we were working very closely, and it led to, I think, an important policy globally.
I don't know if your successor has sought your counsel, but were he to call and ask you about this relationship, the U.S. relationship with China, what would you tell him? I remember hearing from you on that trip to Beijing about how frequently you were in contact with your counterparts there, and there was a lot of effort seemingly put into making that relationship stronger than it had been. What would you tell him worked well? The
relationship requires a lot of attention. I think that every relationship is based on personal interaction, but it is particularly important in China relationships. I think that establishing trust and candor is important. Doesn't mean you ignore hard issues. Your ability to press hard issues forward is increased when you have a relationship where there is that kind of confidence that you're basing your statements on facts and analysis, and you're telling your counterpart what you think. I believe that if you look at the U.S. strategic interest right now, the DPRK issue looms very large. The economic issues within that have to do with sanctions and cooperation between the United States and China on that. We made a lot of progress in the last year of the Obama administration, thanks to the outrageous actions of the government of North Korea. But we worked with China to get a UN Security Council resolution, and the importance of that is both the substance of the agreement, but also the process. China has a very strong view that sanctions should be multilateral, not unilateral. Having an international sanctions regime gives you the ability to press forward much harder than you could if it was just a unilateral action. In the last months of the administration, we pressed very hard, and China was taking actions that it hadn't taken in the past. I don't want to suggest there's not more they can do. There is more China can do, but pressing China to put its effort into having the government in Pyongyang realize that the pressure will get greater and greater is the only way that economic sanctions are going to have effect.
Talking with the former Treasury Secretary Jack Lew here exclusively on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio. Secretary Lew, I'm glad you bring up sanctions. It strikes me that over the course of your tenure, this was something that you relied on more than perhaps your predecessors did. You saw sanctions as a very powerful policy tool. How effective is that now that you look back on it out of office?
First, I think you have to look at the point in time. We were coming out of 2 wars that left the country quite war-weary, but we faced a world with substantial threats that we needed to respond to. And sanctions were available in a way that they had never been before, because we had fine-tuned the way we do sanctions to have them be more highly engineered, more surgical, with less unintended consequence. I think in the case of Iran, they were very effective. In the case of Iran, there's no question but that the U.S. working with the global community to put extraordinary economic pressure on Tehran brought them to the bargaining table and produced an agreement that got Iran to back away from its nuclear program. That's the purpose of sanctions. When you accomplish your goal with sanctions, as I've said over and over again, you have to be willing to provide some relief from the sanctions. Otherwise, they're a useless tool. It can't be that you get the pressure until you act, and then after you act, the pressure stays in the same form. I think we did that in a very careful way, relieving the pressure we put on Iran for its nuclear program, but not relieving the sanctions that were related to its support of terrorism and other bad activities. I think that if you look at Ukraine, we work closely with Europe to put an enormous amount of economic pressure on Russia. Clearly, it hasn't broken the stalemate. The Minsk Accord is still kind of out there, not quite in force. But I do think it affected Russia's appetite for going further into Ukraine and for increasing the level of economic pain it would get. So even though it didn't lead to the ultimate goal, I think it had a tempering effect. The DPRK is really hard. The DPRK is not connected to the world in the way normal countries are, which is why the U.S. China cooperation is so important. There aren't a lot of countries in the world that can put meaningful economic pressure on the DPRK. And that's why I think in the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and China, it's of paramount importance that that issue really take a high priority.
You've got a president now very keen on implementing some tax reform. The White House is adamant that the White House is driving the train, in their words. How much of that would fall on the Treasury Department? And you've heard the reports, I'm sure, that offices are empty, positions are unfilled, nominees haven't even been named. How handicapped is the Treasury Department at this point in going forward with tax reform?
Well, first of all, I think anyone who looks at the real strength institutionally of the Treasury Department has to look beyond the political appointees to the civil servants who are there. The Office of Tax Policy is an extraordinary resource that I don't think Congress could write effective tax law without. I don't think a White House could effectively work through the tax reform process. So the Secretary has an enormous resource available. You know, what you don't have is your policy leaders. You don't have your emissaries who can go and necessarily represent you the way you would if you had a full complement of deputy secretary, undersecretaries, and an assistant secretary for tax policy. So it's not a perfect situation, but I think it would be a mistake to think that Treasury comes to the tax reform debate without very substantial resources. I think the question, as with so many issues, is where the decision-making in the administration will fall and whether the policy leadership will be at the Treasury Department or elsewhere, and within even the White House, which camp in the White House will be making the recommendations and ultimately shape where the president goes. There are some really big decisions ahead. You know, we looked at tax reform and worked with Republicans for many years. There's a lot of support for business tax reform to clear out loopholes, lower the rates. But if you want to do something that's even bigger than we propose going to 28%, it starts to get very expensive. So you've seen Congress looking at ways to kind of pay for going to a lower rate, things like the border adjustment tax, and that's very problematic, both in terms of policy and politics. So the first question is going to be, how big is it? Do they decide to do it on a revenue neutral basis? That means, do they pay for it? Or do they create a big hole in the deficit right as we're at the point where we ought to be thinking about what do we do when the baby boom retires in full force? I think it would be a big mistake to do a big expensive tax cut that isn't paid for. It would not be good for the economy. It would put an enormous amount of pressure on cutting programs like Social Security and Medicare. And I think the right answer is to stick to a paid for approach. I think you can get to a rate that provides real relief if you're willing to take on the loopholes and do it in a bipartisan way. What you can't do is hard things in a completely partisan way. We've seen that not just in the last few weeks, but over the last few decades. In 1986, we could do tax reform together because Republicans and Democrats insulated themselves from the attacks. It was called the showdown at Gucci Gulf for a reason. Yes. You know, it was Dan Rostenkowski and Bob Packwood going out with Jim Baker and saying, we're all together, which made it very hard for others to kind of pick it apart.
Last question here is, we've seen Democrats in the Senate deploy the nuclear option. We are once again up against the debt ceiling, facing a government shutdown at the end of this month. You began your career in Congress as a staffer working for Tip O'Neill. What would you say to somebody in your position today, disillusioned with the fact that there seems to be so much gridlock and dysfunction in Washington? What's your message to that person wondering if there's an effective way to work within the constructs of government?
So, David, I've given this a lot of thought. I think it is hugely important to our democracy that we be able to answer that in a way that gives people hope in a future that's more like the past than the present. I think that if you look at history over the last 40 years that I'm familiar with, the pendulum has gone back and forth. You've had these moments of partisan conflict. It usually doesn't end well. And then there's a working together. We need to get to the working together before there's a lot of damage. You know, there's a government funding deadline coming up in a few weeks. There's a debt limit deadline coming up in a few months. The American people do not want to see chaos and shutdown. And ultimately, if you want to work on a bipartisan basis, you have to do it from the middle, not from the extremes.